Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift across vast Pacific waters to the most remote inhabited island on Earth, where giant stone faces stand in eternal silence, gazing inland toward mountains that once wore forests like green cloaks, watching over an island that holds one of humanity's most profound mysteries. This is your moment to leave behind the noise of today, to step away from screens and schedules and the endless demands of modern life, and step onto volcanic shores where the wind carries salt and stories, where nearly 900 monumental statues rise from earth and platform, each one carved by hands that knew the weight of stone and the depth of reverence, each one a testament to human will and wonder. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through a world that flourished in absolute isolation, separated from the nearest inhabited land by over 1,000 miles of open ocean. We stand before Moai, that tower above us, their backs to the sea, their eyes once inlaid with coral and stone, watching over the descendants who carved them from volcanic rock with nothing but basalt hand axes and determination. We walk the ancient roads where these giants somehow travelled from quarry to coast, moved by methods that scholars still debate, stood upright on platforms built without mortar or metal, monuments to ancestors who became gods, guardians of a culture that thrived and suffered and endured against impossible odds. Each episode here isn't just about Easter Island's famous statues or the theories that try to explain them. It's about the people who arrived in canoes from distant Polynesia, who looked at this lonely speck of land and saw home, who planted gardens and raised families and carved their prayers into stone faces that would outlast everything they built. It's about the beauty they created from hardship, the mysteries they left behind, and the warnings their story whispers to us across centuries of Pacific wind. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. Imagine an island so remote that it floats in the Pacific like a forgotten comma in an endless sentence of blue, a triangle of volcanic rock rising from waters so deep and so far from any other shore that the people who would eventually call it home might as well have been living on another planet. This is Rapa Nui, the island that Europeans would later name Easter Island, a place where isolation wasn't just geography, but destiny, where the nearest inhabited land lay more than 1,000 miles away across open ocean, where the concept of neighbour or enemy or ally existed only within the bounds of 63 square miles of earth and stone and wind. Before humans arrived, before the first canoe beached on black sand shores, this island belonged to seabirds and silence. 3 extinct volcanoes formed its shape, their slopes covered in palm forests that would have seemed almost absurd in their lushness, millions of trees creating a canopy over volcanic soil that held the promise of life. Rano Kau, the largest crater, cradled a freshwater lake in its collapsed heart, a reservoir of survival in the middle of the world's largest ocean. The climate was subtropical, warm enough to grow sweet potatoes and taro, cool enough at night to remind you that you stood on a lonely peak surrounded by water that stretched beyond imagination in every direction. The island had no large mammals, no predators beyond the occasional shark in coastal waters, no competition for resources except what might arrive on the wind or wash ashore from distant catastrophes. It was a blank canvas waiting for the most ambitious painters, a stage set for a drama that would unfold over more than 1,000 years, a laboratory where human nature would conduct experiments in survival, creativity, cooperation, and ultimately, the consequences of isolation and ambition, unchecked by any outside influence or intervention. When the wind blew from the east, which it did most days, it carried no scent of other lands, no hint that civilizations rose and fell beyond the horizon. The island existed in its own time, its own reality, a world complete unto itself. The volcanic soil was rich with minerals from eruptions that had built these mountains from the ocean floor, layer by patient layer, over millions of years. The coastline was mostly rocky, with few natural harbours, the cliffs dropping sharply to waters where waves crashed with persistent rhythm, carving caves and grottos into the island's edges, creating tide pools where small fish gathered and seabirds nested in the spray. At night, the stars appeared in formations that Polynesian navigators would read like maps, constellations that told stories of gods and heroes, and the paths across open water that connected islands scattered across the Pacific like jewels on dark velvet. The Southern Cross hung in the sky, a compass for those who understood its language. The Milky Way stretched overhead, so bright in the absence of any other light that it seemed almost solid, a river of stars flowing through the darkness above an island that didn't yet know it was waiting. Patient and empty, for the moment when double-hulled canoes would crest the horizon and everything would change. The forests whispered in winds that had travelled thousands of miles without touching land. Rain fell in sudden tropical bursts, filling natural basins and running down slopes to the sea. The earth was alive with potential, with the kind of fertility that makes humans dream of permanence, of building something that will outlast the body, of leaving marks that time cannot erase. The island waited, volcanic and green and utterly alone, a stage prepared for one of history's most remarkable and tragic performances, or a place that would become both paradise and prison, canvas for humanity's greatest artistic achievement, and witness to the dangers of pushing natural systems beyond their capacity to sustain life, and culture, and hope. This was Rapa Nui before the world changed, before the Moai rose from quarries, before the first trees fell to make way for gardens and rope, and the movement of stone. This was the setting, perfect in its isolation, terrible in its limitations, beautiful in its simplicity. An island waiting to become legend. The date was April 5th, 1722, Easter Sunday by the Christian calendar, when Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen stood on the deck of his ship and stared at something that should not exist. Through his spyglass, on an island that his charts said might not even be there, he saw figures standing along the shore, enormous and unmoving, their forms too regular to be natural rock formations, too massive to be easily explained by the presence of the small population of people he could see moving among them on the beaches below. Roggeveen had been searching for Terra Australis, that mythical southern continent that Europeans believed must exist to balance the landmass of the north, a place of riches and wonder that would justify the dangerous crossing of the Pacific. Instead, he found an island so remote it might as well have been invisible, a place that appeared on no reliable map, that existed in a part of the ocean where ships simply didn't sail because there was nothing to sail toward, no ports to reach, no trade routes to follow, just endless water and the very real possibility of death from thirst or storm, or the simple mathematics of running out of supplies before finding land. But here was land, and on that land were giants. The Dutch sailors, weathered men who had seen coasts from Java to Cape Horn, who had witnessed temples in India and fortresses in Africa, stood silent as they tried to comprehend what they were observing. The statues, and they must be statues, stood on stone platforms with their backs to the sea, facing inland as if keeping watch over the island's interior. Even from the ship their scale was obvious, figures that rose perhaps 15 or 20 feet into the air, carved from dark stone, their forms simplified and stylized yet somehow deeply expressive, their presence commanding in a way that seemed to exceed mere size. When the Dutch finally went ashore, stepping carefully from longboats onto black sand beaches, they found themselves walking among people who seemed healthy and cheerful, despite living on an island that appeared to offer little in the way of resources. The Rapa Nui, as they called themselves, approached without obvious fear, though they kept a cautious distance, watching these pale strangers who had arrived in vessels larger than anything their own tradition included. The visitors noticed immediately that the islanders had no metal tools, no pottery, no woven cloth beyond simple bark cloth. Yet they had somehow created these massive stone figures that dominated the coastal landscape like sentinels guarding against threats that could only come from the sea. Roggeveen's journals describe his confusion, his attempts to understand how such monuments could exist in such a place. He noted that the statues seemed to be representations of human figures, though stylized, with elongated faces, prominent noses, and what appeared to be cylindrical headdresses of a different reddish stone. Some stood alone, others in groups, arranged on stone platforms that themselves represented significant construction projects, fitted together without mortar in ways that reminded the Dutch sailors of Incan architecture, though they were thousands of miles from Peru and the Inca had no tradition of Pacific voyaging. The islanders called the statues Moai, a word that would eventually reach Europe and become synonymous with mystery and wonder. They treated them with reverence, though some of the figures had been toppled, lying face down in the grass as if they had fallen or been deliberately pushed from their platforms. The Dutch couldn't know that they were witnessing a culture in transition, that the golden age of Moai building had ended perhaps a century before, that the island had been through upheavals that had fractured the society that created these monuments. What struck Roggeveen most was the contradiction, the impossible mathematics of it. This island was tiny, isolated, apparently lacking in resources that would support a large population or sustain the kind of organised labour force necessary to carve and move hundreds of multi-ton statues. Where were the forests that must have provided wood for scaffolding and rollers? Where were the food surpluses that would allow craftsmen to spend months or years carving stone instead of fishing or farming? How did they move these giants from wherever they were carved to these coastal platforms without wheels or large animals or metal tools? The Dutch stayed only briefly, leaving behind musket balls and nails and confusion, sailing away to continue their search for the great southern continent, carrying with them descriptions and rough sketches that would eventually reach European scientific societies and spark debates that continue to this day. They had discovered something that didn't fit into any existing understanding of Pacific cultures, something that suggested either remarkable human achievement in the face of extreme isolation or, as some would later argue with increasing desperation, intervention from forces beyond normal historical explanation. Easter Island had been found, but its mysteries were only beginning to unfold. The Moai stood silent, keeping whatever secrets they knew, their stone faces gazing inland toward the quarry where hundreds of their brothers still lay unfinished, abandoned in various stages of creation, as if the carvers had simply stopped mid-chisel and walked away, leaving their work to weather and time and the questions of strangers who would arrive in ships from worlds the builders never imagined. The news from Roggeveen's expedition travelled slowly back to Europe, carried in ships' logs and official reports, passed between admiralties and scientific societies, translated from Dutch to French to English, accumulating errors and embellishments with each retelling until the basic facts became almost as mysterious as the island itself. When Captain James Cook arrived at Easter Island 52 years later, in 1774, he came prepared for strangeness, armed with Roggeveen's descriptions and his own considerable experience with Pacific cultures, yet even Cook found himself unprepared for the reality of the Moai and the questions they posed. Cook was methodical, trained in observation, inclined toward careful documentation rather than wild speculation. His artist, William Hodges, sketched the statues and the island's sparse landscape, creating images that would eventually appear in published accounts of the voyage, bringing Easter Island into European consciousness as more than rumour or traveller's tale. What struck Cook immediately was the decline he observed, the evidence that this culture had known better days. Many Moai had been toppled, deliberately it seemed, pulled forward from their platforms to lie face down, their necks often broken in the fall. The island's population appeared smaller than Roggeveen had reported, the people thinner, the resources more obviously strained. Cook's men measured the statues, counted them, examined the platforms and the different types of stone used in their construction. They noted that the Moai bodies were carved from a greyish volcanic tuff, relatively soft stone from a quarry they could see in the distance on the slopes of Rano Raraku volcano, while the cylindrical topknots or headdresses were made from red scoria, a different volcanic stone from a different quarry altogether. This meant that creating a single complete Moai required quarrying and transporting at least 2 massive pieces of stone, assembling them at the platform site and somehow raising the entire structure to standing position. The Europeans tried to understand through their own frameworks, comparing the Moai to Egyptian statues, to Greek kouroi, to any precedent that might make sense of what they were seeing. But the comparisons failed because Easter Island had none of the supporting infrastructure those other civilizations possessed. Egypt had the Nile for transportation, vast agricultural surpluses from flood-irrigated fields, and a complex state apparatus that could organize labour on massive scales. Greece had trade networks, metal tools, engineering knowledge accumulated over centuries of Mediterranean culture. Easter Island had isolation, stone tools, and determination. Back in Europe, as Cook's accounts were published and discussed in salons and universities, the responses split along predictable lines. The Romantics seized on Easter Island as evidence of noble savages achieving greatness through pure will and primitive virtue, untainted by European corruption. The rationalists struggled to explain the engineering, proposing theories of ramps and levers and coordinated pulling with rope, trying to reconstruct methods that could move 10 or 15-ton statues across uneven terrain without wheels or large animals. The skeptics simply didn't believe the reports, suggesting exaggeration or misidentification, arguing that the statues must be natural formations that resembled human work, that Pacific Islanders couldn't possibly have created such monuments. This skepticism revealed more about European assumptions than about Rapa Nui capabilities. The idea that dark-skinned people living without metal or writing could create monumental architecture challenged racial hierarchies that Europeans had constructed to justify colonization and slavery. If the Rapa Nui could build the Moai with stone tools and social organization alone, then perhaps technological complexity wasn't the only measure of civilization. Perhaps human ingenuity and cultural achievement existed on spectrums that European categories couldn't capture. Some observers focused on the island's apparent poverty, the lack of trees that must have once existed, the eroded soil and sparse vegetation that seemed inadequate to support the population, let alone feed the workforce necessary for statue construction. They began to construct narratives of ecological collapse, of a civilization that had consumed its resources in the pursuit of ever larger monuments, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and environmental blindness. These interpretations would grow stronger over time, especially as later visitors reported further decline, more fallen statues, fewer people, increasing desperation. Others looked for outside influence, unable or unwilling to credit the Rapa Nui themselves with the achievement. Could the statues be the work of Peruvian visitors, travelling east from South America on balsa rafts? Could they represent a lost connection to the great civilizations of the Inca or earlier Andean cultures? The sweet potato, after all, was a South American crop that had somehow reached Polynesia before European contact, suggesting trans-Pacific voyaging that official histories didn't acknowledge. Perhaps Easter Island was a way station, a meeting place of cultures, its monuments the product of knowledge exchange rather than isolated development. The debate continued in journals and books, in lectures and exhibitions where sketches of the Moai were displayed alongside artifacts from Greece and Rome and Egypt, compared and contrasted, analysed and theorised about. What no one seemed to do, at least not seriously, was ask the Rapa Nui themselves about their history and methods. The islanders were treated as children of a fallen civilization, inheritors of knowledge they no longer understood, their oral traditions dismissed as myth and superstition rather than potential historical record. This would prove to be one of the great failures of early anthropology, this assumption that living people couldn't possibly understand their own past, that only European science could unlock the mysteries of non-European achievement. And so the wonder mixed with skepticism, the amazement tangled with doubt, and Easter Island became a puzzle that Europeans felt entitled to solve, a mystery that said more about the solvers than the solution. The central contradiction of Easter Island struck every visitor with the force of cognitive dissonance, a puzzle that seemed to defy logic and experience. Here was an island measuring roughly 15 miles at its widest point, a tiny speck in an ocean that covered nearly a third of Earth's surface, home to perhaps 3,000 people when Europeans first arrived, and yet scattered across its landscape stood nearly 900 massive stone statues, monuments that represented millions of hours of skilled labour, evidence of social organisation and cultural ambition on a scale that seemed impossible for such a small, isolated population. The mathematics simply didn't work in any framework that made sense. Moving a single 15-ton Moai from the quarry at Rano Raraku to a coastal platform could require hundreds of people pulling in coordination, plus engineers to direct the operation, plus support workers to feed the pullers and maintain the ropes and clear the path, and build the earthen ramps that might be necessary to raise the statue onto its platform. Multiply that by 900 statues, add the time required for carving each one, account for the platforms themselves, which involved quarrying and transporting and precisely fitting massive foundation stones, and you arrive at a total labour investment that suggests a population far larger and more prosperous than the island could apparently support. Where did the food come from to feed this workforce? The island had no large game animals, no native land mammals except rats that had arrived with the first human settlers. The soil was reasonably fertile but limited in extent, the coastline too rocky for easy fishing, the rain unpredictable enough to make agriculture a gamble. Sweet potatoes grew well enough, and chickens could be raised for meat and eggs. but the surplus necessary to support a substantial non-farming population seemed impossible given the island's size and isolation. Yet the Moai existed, undeniable in their solidity, proof that somehow the Rapa Nui had managed what should not have been manageable. The legends that visitors managed to collect from the islanders, often through broken communication and translator chains that introduced their own errors and assumptions, spoke of Moai that walked from the quarry to their destinations, moved by mana rather than muscle, animated by the spiritual power of the ancestors they represented. European listeners dismissed this as primitive superstition, unable to see that the walking might be metaphor, a description of a method rather than a miracle, a way of saying that the statues moved upright, rocking side to side rather than being dragged horizontally on sledges. Other legends spoke of the competition between clans, each trying to honour their ancestors with larger and more impressive Moai, a cultural arms race that drove increasing ambition and investment. The Rapa Nui described a time when the island was forested, when tall palms provided wood for construction and rope making, when the soil was richer and the population larger, when the Moai stood as symbols of prosperity rather than monuments to excess. But by the time Europeans arrived, the forests were gone, reduced to scattered shrubs and grasses, the evidence of their former existence found mainly in pollen cores, taken from lake beds and archaeological excavations that would come much later. The contradiction deepened when researchers began to seriously study the quarry itself. At Rano Raraku, carved into the volcanic slopes, were nearly 400 unfinished Moai in various stages of completion. Some were barely roughed out, their forms suggested but not defined. Others were almost finished, their features carved, their surfaces smoothed, attached to the bedrock by only a thin keel of stone along the spine, ready to be detached and moved. A few giant figures, including one measuring over 70 feet in length, were so ambitious that they seemed designed to never be finished, monuments to hubris more than devotion. Why had the work stopped? What happened to cause the carvers to abandon their tools and leave their creations incomplete, frozen in the moment of becoming? The legend spoke of conflict, of the throwing down of Moai, of wars between clans that had once cooperated in monument building. They spoke of starvation, of resource collapse, of a society that had pushed its environment beyond the breaking point and paid the price in suffering and cultural dissolution. But the legends also insisted that the Moai themselves were not the problem, that they represented connection to ancestors and gods, that their construction was sacred duty rather than wasteful obsession. Modern observers tried to reconcile legend with physical evidence, to separate myth from history and oral traditions that had been shaped by centuries of retelling and by the trauma of European contact, disease and slave raids that had devastated the population and disrupted cultural transmission. What emerged was a picture of profound contradiction, of a people who had achieved something remarkable and paid a terrible price, or perhaps had faced inevitable challenges of isolated survival that the Moai neither caused nor prevented, serving merely as scapegoats for problems more complex than any simple narrative of ecological suicide could capture. The contradiction lived in every Moai face, in the gap between the ambition they represented and the desolation that surrounded them, in the space between what the Rapa Nui said happened and what Europeans believed could have happened, in the tension between admiration for the achievement and horror at the apparent cost. It was a contradiction that said as much about the observers as the observed, about European assumptions about progress and collapse, about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of ruins and the ways those stories reveal our own fears about civilization and sustainability, and the consequences of reaching too far beyond our means. The Moai stood silent through all these debates, keeping their secrets, their stone faces weathered by centuries of Pacific wind and rain, their eyes long since fallen from their sockets, if they ever held inlays at all, their presence commanding attention while offering no easy answers, monuments to human achievement and human limitation, to the glory of creation and the sorrow of what is lost in creating. The 20th century brought new methods to old mysteries, as archaeology developed into a rigorous science and Easter Island became a laboratory for testing theories about human culture, environmental limits, and the rise and fall of civilizations. The debates that emerged were fierce, and often revealed more about the debaters than the island itself, each theory shaped by the intellectual currents and cultural anxieties of its time, each attempting to explain not just how the Moai were built, but what they meant, what their existence said about human nature and the sustainability of human ambition. Thor Heyerdahl arrived in 1955 with a theory ready-made, convinced that Easter Island had been settled from South America rather than from Western Polynesia, that the Moai builders were connected to the great stoneworking cultures of Peru and Bolivia. His evidence was circumstantial, based on similarities he perceived between Rapa Nui monuments and Incan architecture, on the presence of sweet potatoes and other South American crops in Polynesia, on his own successful voyage aboard the Kon-Tiki raft, which proved that crossing the Pacific from east to west was possible if not probable. Heyerdahl arranged experiments showing that Moai could be moved horizontally on wooden sledges, pulled by teams coordinating their effort with ropes, a method that satisfied his need for practical explanation, but ignored Rapa Nui oral traditions about statues that walked. Other researchers pushed back against Heyerdahl's theories, pointing to linguistic evidence, to DNA studies that would eventually prove Polynesian, rather than South American ancestry for the Rapa Nui, to the cultural continuities linking Easter Island to other Polynesian societies across the Pacific. They demonstrated that the Moai, while unique in scale and style, fit within broader Polynesian traditions of ancestor worship and stone carving, that the Ahu platforms resembled moray structures found throughout the Pacific, that the Rapa Nui language belonged unmistakably to the Polynesian family. The debate became heated, tangled with Heyerdahl's celebrity, and his tendency to see evidence for his theories everywhere while dismissing contradicting data as anomalies or corruption. Meanwhile, a darker theory was gaining traction, one that cast Easter Island not as a site of mysterious achievement, but as a cautionary tale of environmental collapse and civilizational suicide. This narrative, popularized by Jared Diamond and others, argued that the Rapa Nui had destroyed their own environment through deforestation, clearing the island's palm forest to provide wood for moving Moai, consuming their resource base in a competitive frenzy of monument building that left the island barren and the population starving. According to this theory, the toppled Moai represented the rage of a dying society, clans blaming each other for the disaster, pulling down the statues in fury and despair as the forest disappeared and the soil eroded and the fish became harder to catch without wood for boats. This collapse narrative resonated with modern environmental concerns, with fears about climate change and deforestation and the limits of growth. Easter Island became a metaphor, a small Earth, a warning about what happens when human ambition outpaces ecological wisdom. The theory appeared in textbooks and documentaries, taught to generations of students as established fact, a parable about the dangers of ignoring environmental limits. The Rapa Nui themselves were cast as victims of their own short-sightedness, people who cut down the last palm tree without considering the consequences, who chose prestige over survival and paid the ultimate price. But this narrative began to fragment under scrutiny. Archaeological evidence suggested that the forests had declined gradually over centuries rather than suddenly, that the Rapa Nui had adapted their practices as resources changed, developing intensive agriculture techniques and coastal fishing methods that sustained the population even as the palms disappeared. Rats, brought to the island by the first settlers, had eaten palm seeds and prevented regeneration, playing a role in deforestation that the monument-building narrative ignored. Climate change, specifically the cooling effects of the Little Ice Age, had reduced rainfall and made agriculture more difficult, a factor entirely outside Rapa Nui control. More recent theories have focused on the ingenuity of Moai construction rather than its supposed wastefulness. Researchers including Joanne van Tilburg and Terry Hunt conducted experiments showing that Moai could indeed be walked upright to their destinations, rocked side to side by teams pulling ropes from different angles, a method that required far fewer people than horizontal dragging and matched the oral traditions that Europeans had dismissed as myth. This walking method meant less environmental impact, less wood consumption, more efficiency than previous theories assumed. The Moai weren't evidence of ecological blindness, but of remarkable engineering adapted to limited resources. Other scholars began questioning the collapse narrative itself, pointing out that the Rapa Nui population was still 3,000 or more when Europeans arrived, that the society was functioning if stressed, that the real collapse came after contact, brought by European diseases, slave raids that removed hundreds of islanders to work in Peruvian mines, and the cultural disruption that followed. The toppled Moai might not represent pre-contact clan warfare, but rather post-contact chaos, a society fragmenting under external pressures rather than internal failure. The cautionary tale of environmental suicide might be largely projection, a story Europeans told themselves using Rapa Nui history as a screen for their own anxieties. The debates continue, conducted now with more sophisticated methods, more attention to Rapa Nui voices and perspectives, more caution about imposing narratives that serve modern agendas rather than historical truth. What emerges is a picture more complex than any single theory can capture, a history of adaptation and achievement, of challenges met with creativity, of a culture that survived isolation and created beauty in one of the most remote places humans have ever chosen to call home. The serious archaeological investigation of Easter Island began in earnest during the 20th century, as researchers moved beyond simple documentation and began systematic excavation, analysis, and experimental archaeology designed to test theories about Moai construction and the society that created them. This work transformed Easter Island from a mysterious anomaly into a comprehensible, if still remarkable, example of human adaptation to extreme isolation, each discovery adding pieces to a puzzle that would never be completely solved, but could at least be approached with method and care. Catherine Routledge arrived in 1914, one of the first professionally trained archaeologists to study the island seriously. She conducted surveys, mapped Ahu platforms, interviewed elderly Rapa Nui who still remembered oral traditions about the Moai and the society that built them. Her work was interrupted by World War I and marred by her subsequent mental illness, but her notes and photographs preserved information that would otherwise have been lost as the last generation with direct cultural memory passed away. She documented hundreds of Moai, measured their proportions, noted the standardization of features that suggested templates or training methods, passed between Carvers, recorded place names and clan territories, and the locations of various quarries and workshops across the island. Later expeditions built on Routledge's foundation, using increasingly sophisticated techniques. William Molloy conducted extensive restoration work in the 1960s and 70s, rebuilding fallen Moai and their platforms to give visitors a sense of how the monuments looked when first erected. His work was controversial, criticised by some as reconstruction rather than preservation, but it provided valuable insights into Ahu construction methods, revealing the precision of stone fitting, the use of coral rubble fill, the careful positioning of Moai to account for the platform's orientation, and the statue's weight distribution. Molloy's reconstructions at Ahuakivi, where 7 Moai stand in an inland location facing the sunset, rather than looking over the coast, demonstrated that Moai placement followed complex astronomical and cultural logic rather than simple aesthetic choice. The quarry at Rano Raraku became a focus of intense study. Researchers mapped every unfinished Moai, noting their positions and stages of completion, looking for patterns that might reveal the sequence of work and the reasons for abandonment. What they found was evidence of sophisticated quarrying technique. Carvers working in narrow trenches cut into the volcanic tuff, using basalt handpicks to chip away the stone around the emerging statue. The Moai were carved face up, lying on their backs, their undersides left rough and attached to the bedrock by a keel that would be the last part freed when the statue was ready to move. But how did they move them? This question drove numerous experiments over the decades. Heyerdahl had shown that Moai could be dragged horizontally on wooden sledges, but this method required enormous labour, extensive use of wood, and contradicted oral traditions. In the 1980s, Czech engineer Pavel Pavel and Norwegian adventurer Thor Heyerdahl tried standing a Moai upright and walking it using ropes, but their attempt was clumsy and nearly toppled the replica statue. The technique seemed possible but difficult, requiring more refinement than they had achieved. Johan van Tilburg spent years studying Moai in detail, measuring and documenting every statue on the island, analysing their proportions and variations, creating a comprehensive database that revealed patterns in size, style, and distribution. Her work showed that Moai evolved over time, early statues smaller and simpler, later ones growing larger and more elaborate, suggesting a cultural trajectory of increasing ambition and technical skill. She also documented the red scoria top knots, showing that not all Moai received them, that the pukau as they were called were probably final additions, possibly representing a hairstyle or headdress specific to chiefs or high-status ancestors. In 2012, Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo conducted the most convincing walking experiments yet, using a 10-ton concrete replica Moai and carefully coordinated rope teams. They demonstrated that a statue could be moved upright, rocking from side to side, walking forward with remarkable efficiency, requiring fewer than 20 people pulling 3 ropes attached to the head and sides. The Moai moved slowly but steadily, its centre of gravity carefully managed, its base rounded to facilitate the rocking motion. This method matched oral traditions, required minimal wood, and worked even on the earthen roads that still trace across the island between quarry and coast. Archaeological excavation revealed other aspects of Rapa Nui society that helped explain Moai construction. The population at its peak was probably between 10 and 15,000, larger than early European estimates suggested, sustained by intensive agriculture using stone mulching to preserve moisture and protect plants from salt spray. The Rapa Nui had developed manavai, circular stone-walled gardens that created microclimates for growing bananas and other crops, and had built extensive chicken coops of stone, creating a reliable protein source that didn't require hunting or fishing. These innovations showed adaptation rather than environmental blindness, a culture working within limits rather than ignoring them. Excavations at Ahu platforms uncovered evidence of dedication ceremonies, burial chambers containing ancestor bones, deposits of red ochre and obsidian tools that suggested ritual use and sacred significance. The Moai weren't just monuments, but active participants in ceremonial life, their eyes inlaid with coral and stone during special occasions to make them see, to activate their mana and allow them to watch over their descendants, to protect the land and ensure fertility and success. The toppling of Moai might have been deliberate desecration during clan conflicts, or it might have been symbolic transformation, closing the eyes of ancestors who had failed to protect their people from disaster. The investigation continues, using new technologies, ground-penetrating radar, 3-dimensional scanning, DNA analysis of ancient bones and modern populations, chemical analysis of obsidian tools to trace their quarry sources and distribution patterns. Each technique adds detail, confirms or refutes theories, builds a picture of Rapa Nui society that is recognizably human, neither supermen who built the impossible nor fools who destroyed themselves, but people adapting to circumstances, creating culture and meaning and beauty in one of the harshest and most isolated environments humans ever chose to inhabit permanently. The physical evidence left by the Rapa Nui civilization speaks in stone and soil, and the spaces between, fragments that archaeologists piece together like a shattered pot, each shard revealing something about the whole, while leaving gaps that interpretation and imagination must bridge. The Moai themselves are the most obvious evidence, nearly 900 stone figures scattered across the island in various states of completion and preservation, but they are far from the only traces of the culture that created them. The Ahu platforms number about 300 stretched, along the coastline like a necklace of stone, each one a major construction project representing thousands of hours of labour. These platforms varied in size from small family structures to massive ceremonial complexes like Ahu Tongariki, which held 15 Moai and measured more than 200 feet in length. The platforms were built without mortar, massive stones fitted together with precision, filled with coral rubble and smaller stones, their faces finished with carefully shaped blocks that created smooth vertical or slightly battered walls. Many Ahu were oriented astronomically, aligned to solstices or equinoxes, suggesting that the Rapa Nui tracked celestial events and incorporated astronomical knowledge into their sacred architecture. Within and beneath many Ahu, archaeologists found burial chambers containing human bones, sometimes cremated, sometimes whole, often in disturbed positions suggesting that the tombs had been opened and closed multiple times, bones rearranged or removed during later ceremonies. These burials confirmed what oral tradition maintained, that the Ahu were sacred spaces, memorials to the dead, places where the living could communicate with ancestors and seek their blessings and protection. The Moai standing on the platforms were likely specific ancestors, chiefs or important family members whose mana continued to protect and nourish their descendants long after their physical bodies had returned to Earth. The quarry at Ranararaku preserves the most complete record of Moai production, a frozen moment in the island's history where work stopped and never resumed. Nearly 400 Moai in various stages of completion cover the slopes, from barely outlined figures still connected to the living rock to finished statues standing in pits, apparently waiting to be transported but abandoned before the journey could begin. The unfinished Moai show the carving process clearly. Trenches cut around the emerging figure, basalt hand picks left scattered in the excavation, marks showing where carvers had pecked away the volcanic tuff to free the statue from its stone matrix. Some Moai at Rano Raraku display unexpected features, their backs covered with relief carvings that would be invisible once the statue was erected on a platform. These carvings show stylized images that might represent tattoos or body painting, geometric patterns, possibly birds or canoe designs, cultural information encoded in stone where it would be hidden but not destroyed, perhaps intended for spiritual rather than human viewing. The presence of these hidden carvings suggests that Moai creation was sacred work, every aspect imbued with meaning and purpose beyond mere artistic display. The red scoria top knots, carved at a separate quarry at Punapau, provide additional evidence of the complexity of Moai construction and the cultural meanings attached to the complete monument. These cylindrical or slightly squared pukao weighed several tons each, had to, be transported separately from the Moai bodies and then somehow lifted and placed on top of statues that already stood 12 or 15 feet tall on platform bases. The engineering required for this final step must have been impressive, probably involving ramps or scaffolding, careful balancing of weight and leverage. The red stone contrasts dramatically with the grey tuff of the Moai bodies, creating a visual impact that must have been striking. The ancestors made complete and powerful, crowned and ready to watch over their people. Stone tools survive in thousands, scattered across the island but concentrated at quarries and workshops. The toki or hand axes, made from basalt, were the primary carving implements, simple tools requiring skill and patience to use effectively. Obsidian flakes, sharper and more delicate, were used for detail work, for carving features and smoothing surfaces, for creating the mada tools used in tattooing and other precision work. The abundance of these tools, their standardized forms, suggests specialized production, master toolmakers supplying the carvers, economic relationships and trade networks within the island's small geography. Complexity that a 3,000-person population shouldn't theoretically support but somehow did. The agricultural evidence, less obvious but equally important, appears in the stone structures that cover much of the island's interior. The Manavai gardens, circular walls of stacked stone creating windbreaks and moisture traps, allowed cultivation of bananas and other sensitive crops in an environment that would otherwise be too harsh. Stone mulching, where small rocks were spread across planted fields to reduce evaporation and stabilize soil temperature, turned marginal land productive, allowing the Rapa Nui to squeeze more food from their limited acreage than should have been possible. These agricultural innovations required knowledge, experimentation, cultural transmission of technique, evidence that the Rapa Nui were active problem solvers rather than passive victims of environmental challenges. The Rongorongo tablets, wooden boards covered with incised glyphs, represent the most enigmatic evidence, a writing system, or proto-writing, that no one can reliably read. Only 25 tablets survive, most collected by European visitors in the 19th century, their meanings lost when the last readers died without passing on their knowledge. The glyphs combine stylized human figures, birds, fish, plants, and geometric symbols in alternating lines that reverse direction, a format called reverse boustrophedon, where each line reads opposite to the one above. Whether Rongorongo represents true writing capable of recording language or serves as a mnemonic device for ritual chanters remains disputed, but its existence proves intellectual sophistication, symbolic thought, the desire to preserve information beyond oral transmission. Together, these fragments build a picture of Rapa Nui, culture that is both familiar and strange, recognizably human in its concerns with ancestry, ritual, social hierarchy and survival, yet unique in its solutions, its artistic expression, its adaptation to circumstances unlike anywhere else humans had settled. The evidence speaks of achievement and challenge, of creativity and limitation, of a people who made their lonely island into a place of meaning and beauty while struggling with problems that isolation and environment made inevitable. Beneath the surface, questions about how the Moai were carved and moved lies a deeper mystery, one that touches on the nature of belief itself and the ways human cultures invest objects with meaning that transcends their physical existence. The Moai were never just statues, never merely demonstrations of engineering skill or artistic achievement, never simply monuments to chiefly ego or clan competition. They were, In the truest sense the Rapa Nui understood it, living presences, ancestors made manifest in stone, beings whose mana or spiritual power protected the living and connected them to forces that sustained life itself. This understanding changes everything about how we interpret the archaeological evidence and the oral traditions that have survived, however fragmentarily, from pre-contact culture. When the Rapa Nui said the Moai walked from quarry to platform, they weren't speaking metaphorically about engineering techniques, though the walking method recently demonstrated by researchers may indeed represent the physical truth. They were describing spiritual reality, the way ancestors imbued with mana could move through their own power, animated by forces that didn't distinguish between physical and spiritual causation, the way European thought insisted on doing. The Moai faced inland, their backs to the sea, their elongated eyes designed to watch over the land and the people who worked it, who planted sweet potatoes and raised chickens and fished from rocky shores. Their presence wasn't decorative but functional, their seeing activated during ceremonies when eyes of white coral and red scoria were placed in the deep sockets carved for that purpose, making the ancestors truly present, truly capable of blessing or withholding blessing from the activities conducted under their gaze. The Moai were mediators between the living and the dead, between the visible world of daily survival and the invisible world of spiritual forces that determined whether crops would grow, whether children would be born healthy, whether the community would prosper or decline. This spiritual function explains aspects of Moai construction that purely materialist interpretations struggle with. Why were some Moai so enormous, like the 70-foot giant still partially attached to the quarry bedrock at Ranararaku, clearly too large to ever be moved or erected with the technology available? Because size mattered spiritually as well as physically, because a truly powerful ancestor deserved a truly impressive body, because the act of carving itself was sacred work that honoured the dead regardless of whether the statue reached completion. The unfinished Moai weren't failures but ongoing relationships, conversations between the living and their ancestors that circumstances interrupted but didn't invalidate. The toppling of Moai, which Europeans interpreted as evidence of warfare and social collapse, may have had spiritual dimensions that outsiders couldn't perceive. Pulling down an ancestor statue wasn't just vandalism or military strategy. It was attacking the spiritual protection of a rival clan, closing the eyes that watched over their land, severing the connection between living descendants and the mana that flowed from properly honoured dead. But it might also have been a way of transforming spiritual relationships when the old ways failed, when ancestors seemed to have abandoned their people to suffering, when new spiritual systems needed to emerge from the rubble of what no longer worked. The Birdman cult that arose in the later period of Rapa Nui history, replacing Moai construction as the central spiritual and social practice, represents not decline but adaptation, a shift in how the community understood its relationship with spiritual power. The annual competition at Orongo, where representatives of different clans raced down cliff faces, swam through shark-infested waters to offshore islets, and competed to return with the first sooty turn egg of the season, transferred mana from stone ancestors to living champions, from permanent monuments to annual renewal, from hierarchy based on descent to hierarchy based on achievement and risk. This transformation suggests that the Rapa Nui were capable of profound spiritual and social innovation, that they could recognize when existing systems no longer served their needs and create new ones, that their culture was dynamic rather than static, alive rather than fossilized. The Moai period represented one phase of cultural development, brilliant in its achievements, but not the only possible expression of Rapa Nui identity and spiritual life. The shift to the Birdman cult may have come from environmental stress, from the end of the forest period, and the challenges of sustaining a population on increasingly limited resources. But it also came from creative response to crisis, from the ability to imagine different ways of organizing society and relating to the sacred. What the Europeans never understood, what many modern observers still struggle to grasp, is that the Moai weren't products of a civilization that destroyed itself through environmental blindness and competitive excess. They were expressions of a spiritual worldview in which ancestors remained present and active, in which the boundary between living and dead was permeable, in which stone could embody mana and carved eyes could truly see. The apparent contradiction between the island's resource limitations and the scale of monument construction dissolves when you understand that Moai carving wasn't wasteful consumption, but spiritual necessity, work that had to be done regardless of cost because it maintained the relationships that made life meaningful and sustainable. The deeper mystery isn't how the Moai were built, but why building them mattered enough to sustain centuries of effort, why generation after generation chose to invest their labour and creativity in creating these monuments, why the quarry at Ranararaku filled with hundreds of emerging ancestors, even as the forests declined and the challenges of island life intensified. The answer lies in understanding that the Rapa Nui weren't rational economic actors, calculating costs and benefits in material terms alone. They were human beings creating meaning in a world that could seem vast and empty and terrifying in its isolation. People who needed their ancestors watching over them more than they needed efficiency or sustainability as modern observers define those terms. The Moai stand as evidence of what humans will do when spiritual necessity drives action, when culture demands expression regardless of practical concerns, when meaning matters more than material calculation. They are monuments to faith in the broadest sense, faith that honouring ancestors properly would ensure community survival, faith that manna was real and powerful and accessible through proper ritual and carving, faith that human effort could bridge the gap between living and dead and create security in a precarious world. That faith may have been tested, may have failed in some senses, may have transformed into different expressions, but it sustained a culture in one of the most challenging environments humans ever inhabited, and that alone makes the Moai witnesses to something profound about human nature and human need. The story of Easter Island begins not with stone carving, but with wooden canoes, with Polynesian voyagers crossing thousands of miles of open Pacific, navigating by stars and swells and the flight patterns of seabirds, searching for new lands to settle in an ocean that covered a third of the Earth's surface. The arrival of those first settlers, probably around 800 CE, though dates remain debated and uncertain, represents the true turning point, the moment when an empty island became a human world, when possibility transformed into reality, and the stage was set for everything that would follow. Imagine the perspective of those first arrivals, standing on the beach after weeks at sea, looking at an island that showed no signs of previous human habitation, no smoke from cooking fires, no carved images or stone platforms, nothing but volcanic peaks covered in forest, seabirds wheeling overhead in numbers that suggested easy hunting, soil that promised good growing conditions for the crops they carried in their canoes. This was virgin territory, unclaimed by any other human group, a blank canvas where they could build society according to their own vision and values, unrestricted by neighbours or enemies, or the political complications that made life difficult on more crowded islands to the west. The settlers brought with them the full package of Polynesian culture, the plants and animals and tools and knowledge that had allowed their ancestors to colonize islands across the Pacific. They carried sweet potato and taro, banana suckers and sugarcane, paper mulberry for making bark cloth, chickens in cages, and probably pigs and dogs, though those animals didn't survive to the historical period for reasons unclear. They brought fish hooks of bone and stone, adzes for woodworking, knowledge of navigation and boat building and agricultural technique refined over centuries of island living. They brought language and stories, gods and rituals, social structures based on chiefly hierarchy and family relationships, all the intangible software of culture that would be adapted to local conditions as generations passed. Those first years, perhaps first generations, must have seemed like paradise realized. The island's palm forests, members of the Jubea genus related to the Chilean wine palm, grew in groves that provided wood for construction, for making canoes and rope, for fuel and tool handles. The soil responded well to cultivation, sweet potatoes and taro producing reliable harvests. Seabirds nested in such numbers that collecting eggs and hunting adults for food required minimal effort, providing protein without the labour of fishing or animal husbandry. The population grew steadily, families establishing themselves in different areas of the island, claiming land and coastal access, beginning the process of social differentiation that would eventually produce the clan structure and chiefly hierarchies documented in later oral traditions. The moment when the first Moai was carved marks another turning point, a decision to invest labour and creativity in creating permanent monuments rather than focusing entirely on survival and reproduction. This decision didn't come from nowhere. It emerged from Polynesian traditions of stone carving and ancestor worship that the settlers brought with them, adapted and amplified to island conditions and whatever spiritual experiences or social needs drove the cultural innovation. The early Moai were small by later standards, simple in their features, experimental in technique, but they established the pattern that would define Rapa Nui culture for centuries, the commitment to honouring ancestors in stone, to creating visibility for spiritual presences, to marking the landscape with human meaning and purpose. As the population grew and spread across the island, different clans established their territories, built their ahu platforms, began carving moai to stand upon them. The work created social structure, provided purpose for specialised craftsmen, generated prestige for families who could organise the labour and resources necessary to produce larger and more impressive monuments. The moai became focal points for ceremony and identity, each clan competing to honour their ancestors more spectacularly, each generation trying to surpass the achievements of their parents and grandparents, the cultural trajectory bending toward increasing scale and ambition. This period, roughly from around 1000 CE to perhaps 1600 CE, represents the golden age of Moai construction, when the forest still stood through thinning, when the population peaked at perhaps 15,000, when the social organisation necessary to sustain specialised labour and large-scale construction projects functioned smoothly enough to produce hundreds of statues. This was when the quarry at Rano became the centre of activity, when carvers developed standardised techniques and proportions, when the walking method of transportation was perfected, when the platform builders learned to fit massive stones without mortar in ways that have survived earthquakes and centuries of weathering. But within this golden age, stresses were building. The palm forest declined as trees were cut for construction and rope making, as rats brought by the first settlers ate seeds and prevented regeneration, as climate shifts reduced rainfall and made the trees more vulnerable to drought and disease. The soil began to erode without tree roots to hold it. Agricultural productivity declined. The population that had grown during centuries of plenty now pressed against the limits of what the island could sustainably support. The easy protein from seabird colonies became harder to access as the birds themselves declined, their population stressed by human predation and by rats that ate eggs and chicks, by the general degradation of nesting habitat. The moai themselves may have contributed to these stresses, not through wastefulness as some collapse narratives suggest, but simply through the opportunity cost they represented. Labour invested in carving and moving statues was labour not available for intensive agriculture, or resource management or adaptation to changing conditions. The spiritual necessity of honouring ancestors in ever more impressive ways competed with the practical necessity of feeding a growing population on a declining resource base, a tension that the society managed for generations but couldn't resolve permanently. The turning point when everything changed wasn't a single moment, but a cascade, a series of challenges and adaptations and failures that accelerated in the centuries before European contact. The last trees disappeared, making canoe construction impossible and limiting fishing to nearshore waters accessible by reed boats. The moai carving slowed and stopped. The quarry at Rano abandoned with hundreds of statues unfinished. The cultural focus shifting from monument building to the Birdman competition and the fortified cave refuges that suggest increasing conflict. The Yid population declined, whether from starvation or warfare or simply the reduced carrying capacity of a degraded environment, falling to the 3,000 or so that Europeans encountered in the 18th century. This cascade of change, this transformation from the Golden Age to the period of stress and adaptation, represents the real turning point, not the arrival of Europeans, though that would bring its own catastrophes, but the internal dynamics of a society pushing against the limits of its environment while trying to maintain cultural practices that had defined identity and purpose for centuries. It's a story of human limitation and human resilience, of the costs of isolation and the creativity that isolation can inspire, of the gap between what people hope to achieve and what circumstances allow them to sustain. The immediate consequences of Easter Island's environmental transformation rippled through every aspect of Rapa Nui society, reshaping social structures, spiritual practices, and the daily struggles of survival in ways that were sometimes catastrophic and sometimes surprisingly creative. The disappearance of the palm forests by around 1600 CE didn't happen suddenly. It was a gradual process spanning generations, but its effects accumulated until they reached a threshold beyond which the old ways simply couldn't continue, forcing adaptations that preserved the society even as they transformed its fundamental character. Without large trees, the Rapa Nui could no longer build the substantial canoes necessary for deep water fishing, limiting their access to the open ocean species that had provided reliable protein. This meant greater dependence on nearshore fishing from small reed boats called pora, delicate watercraft made from totora reeds that grew in the crater lakes, capable of operating in relatively calm coastal waters, but useless for serious ocean voyaging or fishing the deeper banks where larger fish schooled. The loss of oceanic fishing reduced dietary protein, contributing to nutritional stress that archaeological studies have detected in the bones of later period populations, evidence of shorter stature and more frequent signs of childhood malnutrition compared to earlier generations. The inability to build substantial boats had another consequence, perhaps even more significant. It meant that the Rapa Nui were truly trapped on their island, unable to leave even if they wanted to, cut off from the wider Polynesian world in ways their ancestors had never been. The first settlers had arrived by choice, navigating intentionally or perhaps discovering the island by accident, but able to return to other islands if the new land proved unsuitable. Their descendants, living in the deforested later period, had no such options. They were committed to Easter Island absolutely, for better or worse, with no possibility of escape or resupply or communication with other human populations. The psychological weight of this total isolation is hard to imagine. The knowledge that your island is your entire world, that no help can come, that adaptation or death are the only choices. The end of Moai construction represented not just environmental necessity, but spiritual crisis. For centuries, the proper way to honour ancestors and ensure their protective manner had been to carve them in stone, to stand them on platforms where they could watch over the land and people. When that became impossible, when the resources and labour couldn't be sustained, what did it mean? Had the ancestors abandoned their people? Had the living failed in their sacred duties? The toppling of Moai that occurred during this period, whether from clan warfare or deliberate spiritual transformation, suggests that the relationship between living and dead needed to be renegotiated, that the old compact had broken down and something new needed to emerge. The Birdman cult that arose to fill the spiritual void created by the end of Moai building represented a radical reimagining of how mana could be accessed and distributed. Instead of permanent stone monuments embodying ancestral power, the new system centered on annual competition, physical prowess, and risk-taking. Representatives of different clans would gather at Orongo, the ceremonial village perched on the crater rim of Rano Kau, waiting for the arrival of sooty terns to the offshore islets of Motunui, Motu Iti, and Motu Kau Kau. When the birds began nesting, competitors would descend the 1,000-foot cliffs, swim through dangerous currents and shark-infested waters, and race to find the first egg of the season. The discovery bringing immense prestige and spiritual authority to their clan's chief for the entire year. This transformation from permanent to temporary, from ancestral to achieved mana, may seem like decline from the perspective of Moai building glory, but it represented remarkable cultural flexibility, the ability to maintain social cohesion and spiritual meaning even when environmental conditions made the old practices impossible. The Birdman competition created excitement and purpose, gave young men an outlet for competitive energy that might otherwise have fueled destructive warfare, provided a mechanism for distributing political authority that didn't depend on accumulated wealth or resources that no longer existed in surplus quantities. The archaeological record from this later period shows evidence of increased conflict. Fortified caves where people stored food and valuables and could retreat during attacks. Obsidian spear points called matea scattered across battle sites. Oral traditions speaking of wars between clans that had once cooperated in Moai construction. But this warfare shouldn't be interpreted as simple societal collapse. It was competition for increasingly scarce resources, struggle over the best agricultural land and fishing spots, the kind of conflict that emerges in many societies under environmental stress. The Rapa Nui adapted by developing new fighting techniques, by building defensive structures, by creating social mechanisms like the Birdman cult that channeled conflict into ritual competition with lower casualties than outright warfare. Agricultural practices intensified during this period, evidence of innovation rather than defeat. The Manavai gardens, stone-walled enclosures creating microclimates for sensitive crops, multiplied across the island. Stone mulching became more widespread, covering fields with small rocks to reduce evaporation and protect soil. Chicken coops expanded, massive stone structures that protected the birds from theft and predation, while allowing manure collection for fertilizer. The Rapa Nui were squeezing more food from less favourable conditions, using knowledge and labour to compensate for the degraded natural environment. The population declined during this period, probably from around 15,000 at its peak to the 3,000 that Europeans encountered. But this decline represents adjustment to carrying capacity rather than complete collapse. 3,000 people surviving on Easter Island in the post-forest period, maintaining cultural coherence and creating new spiritual systems, and continuing to raise families and produce art, should be seen as success rather than failure, as evidence of human resilience and adaptability rather than environmental stupidity and social suicide. The consequences of environmental transformation were real and serious, including nutritional stress, increased conflict, spiritual crisis, and population decline. But the Rapa Nui survived, adapted, created new cultural forms that maintained social meaning and cohesion even as the material conditions of life became more difficult. They were still there when European ships arrived, still maintaining their language and traditions, still connected to their ancestors, even if the connection was expressed through birdman competition rather than stone statues. This is not a story of simple fall, but of transformation, of human communities proving capable of remarkable flexibility when circumstances demand change and when the alternative is extinction. Easter Island's influence on modern consciousness extends far beyond its physical isolation, the story of the Moai and the society that created them resonating through academic discourse, environmental movements, and popular culture in ways that the Rapa Nui themselves could never have anticipated. The island has become what anthropologists call a master narrative, a story that cultures tell themselves to explain larger truths about human nature, civilization, and the relationship between societies and their environments, a parable that changes meaning depending on who tells it, and when, and why. The most pervasive modern impact of Easter Island is its role as environmental cautionary tale, the small Earth metaphor where an isolated population consuming its resources without sustainable management serves as warning about the trajectory of global civilization. This interpretation, popularized by Jared Diamond in his book Collapse, and widely taught in environmental science and sustainability courses, presents Easter Island as proof that humans can and will destroy their environment even when doing so guarantees their own suffering, that short-term thinking and competition for status can overwhelm long-term survival interests, that we are capable of cutting down the last tree even when we know it's the last tree. This narrative has shaped environmental activism and policy debates, used to argue for everything from carbon emission controls to population management, to limits on economic growth. Easter Island becomes a thought experiment made real, a place where the consequences of unsustainable development played out completely, where you can see the endpoint of resource depletion without the complexity that makes causation unclear in larger, more connected societies. The image of toppled Moai scattered across barren landscape serves as visual shorthand for environmental collapse, appearing in documentaries and textbooks and activist materials as a warning that seems all the more powerful because it's historical rather than hypothetical. But this environmental narrative has also been challenged and complicated by more recent scholarship, by researchers who argue that the collapse story oversimplifies what happened on Easter Island, that it ignores Rapa Nui resilience and adaptation, that it places blame on the victims while ignoring the catastrophic impact of European contact and subsequent colonial exploitation. These counter-narratives haven't penetrated popular consciousness as deeply, but they're shaping academic discourse and slowly influencing how the island's history is taught and understood, moving from simple morality tale toward more nuanced appreciation of human complexity in the face of environmental and social challenges. Easter Island has also influenced archaeology and anthropology methodologically, becoming a case study in experimental archaeology, where researchers test theories by actually attempting to replicate ancient technologies and techniques. The Moai walking experiments, the studies of stone tool efficiency, the reconstructions of Ahu platforms, all represent a hands-on approach to understanding the past that goes beyond excavation and analysis to include doing, building, moving, carving. This experimental tradition has spread to other archaeological sites and questions, the willingness to test ideas physically rather than just debating them theoretically, the recognition that ancient people were practical problem solvers whose solutions can often be understood by attempting to solve the same problems with similar constraints. the island has entered popular culture as shorthand for mystery and lost civilizations, appearing in science fiction and fantasy as a place where ancient wisdom or alien contact left traces, where secrets of vanished peoples wait to be discovered. The Moai themselves have become icons, instantly recognizable even to people who know nothing else about Pacific history. Their enigmatic faces appearing on everything from tourism posters to emoji keyboards to video game landscapes. This cultural visibility has paradoxical effects, raising awareness of Easter Island while often distorting its actual history, making it famous while keeping it mysterious, celebrating Rapa Nui achievement while sometimes denying Rapa Nui agency. For the modern Rapa Nui people, the island's global fame has brought both opportunities and challenges. Tourism provides economic benefits, but also threatens cultural sites with damage from millions of visitors, raises questions about who controls the narrative and who benefits from the island's story. The Moai belong to the Rapa Nui in ways that go beyond property law. They are ancestors and cultural heritage and identity made visible, but they also belong to global heritage in ways that UNESCO designation and international interest make concrete. Navigating this tension between local meaning and global significance, between cultural preservation and economic development, between honouring the past and adapting to contemporary realities, remains an ongoing challenge that the small Rapa Nui population manages with varying success. The island has influenced scientific understanding of human migration and adaptation, providing evidence for Polynesian voyaging capabilities, for how human populations respond to isolation and environmental limits, for the development of unique cultural forms in circumstances that might seem too harsh to support complexity. Studies of Rapa Nui language, genetics, and material culture have contributed to broader understanding of Pacific settlement patterns, of how Polynesian peoples spread across the world's largest ocean over the course of millennia, of the incredible navigational knowledge and courage required to cross thousands of miles of open water in wooden canoes to reach islands that you couldn't be certain existed. Easter Island has shaped debate about sustainability and development in island contexts specifically, becoming a touchstone for discussions about carrying capacity, renewable resources, the risks of isolation and monoculture, the importance of maintaining flexibility and diversity in subsistence strategies. Small island developing states from the Caribbean to the Pacific reference Easter Island when arguing for international support and recognition of their environmental vulnerability, using the historical example to make contemporary political points about climate change, sea level rise, and the responsibilities of larger nations to smaller ones. The deeper impact may be philosophical and psychological, the way Easter Island forces confrontation with human limitation and human capability, with what people can achieve and what circumstances can destroy, with the price of ambition and the value of meaning even when meaning comes at material cost. The Moai stand as proof that humans will create beauty and significance even in impossible circumstances, that culture matters as much as survival, that the urge to make permanent marks and honour ancestors and invest labour in something beyond immediate necessity is fundamental to human nature across all cultures and time periods. Easter Island shaped our world by becoming a mirror, reflecting back whatever we bring to it, showing us what we fear or hope about human nature and environmental limits, and the sustainability of civilization. It's a Rorschach test in volcanic stone, an island that means whatever its observers need it to mean, and that multiplicity of meaning may be its greatest impact. The way it keeps generating new interpretations and debates and insights, refusing to settle into single simple story, remaining productively mysterious even as we learn more about what actually happened there. Behind the Moai, beneath the theories and debates about environmental collapse and cultural achievement, lived actual human beings whose names and faces have largely been lost to time but whose experiences and choices created the history that archaeologists and tourists encounter. These were not abstract actors in an environmental morality play, but people with hopes and fears, families and friendships, daily routines and occasional moments of transcendence, individuals whose collective actions over generations built the culture that carved stone giants and somehow sustained life in one of Earth's most isolated inhabited places. The master carvers at Rano-Raraku, whose names we will never know, spent their lives in intimate relationship with stone, learning from older craftsmen how to read the volcanic tuff, how to find flaws that might crack during carving, how to work with the grain and fracture patterns, how to create the smooth surfaces and precise features that made Moai recognizable as ancestors rather than mere rock. These carvers developed techniques passed from father to son, or master to apprentice, accumulating knowledge over generations about proportions and structural integrity, about how deep a trench to cut around the emerging statue, about when to detach the keel that connected the Moai to bedrock, about the prayers and ceremonies that made the work sacred rather than merely technical. Imagine a young man, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, beginning his apprenticeship in the quarry, watching his uncle or grandfather demonstrate the proper way to hold the basalt handpick, the angle and force needed to chip stone effectively, without shattering the tool or wasting motion. He would spend months or years on simple tasks, roughing out the basic form while master carvers worked on details and finishing, learning patience and precision, understanding that a single careless blow could ruin weeks of careful work, internalizing the spiritual significance of creating a body for an ancestor who would watch over the family and land for generations to come. The women of Rapa Nui, mostly invisible in archaeological record and oral traditions that focus on chiefs and warriors and carvers, carried the daily burden of survival, tending the gardens, raising children, preparing food, making bark cloth and maintaining households, while men carved stone or competed in birdman races or conducted the ceremonies that maintained cosmic order. They were expert farmers who understood which sweet potato varieties thrived in different soils, who knew when to plant and harvest by reading wind patterns and star positions, who developed the stone mulching techniques that preserved moisture and extended growing seasons. They raised chickens in those massive stone coops, collecting eggs and managing breeding, turning a small population of birds brought in the original settlement canoes into a reliable protein source that sustained the population when other food sources failed. Consider a woman named perhaps Hina or Vai, or some name preserved in family traditions but not in written records, waking before dawn to check fish traps set in tidal pools the previous evening, walking carefully on slick volcanic rock while the ocean crashes nearby, pulling out small reef fish and octopus, returning home to start cooking fires and prepare the morning meal before heading to her garden plot where sweet potatoes need harvesting, and taro needs watering from precious fresh water carried in gourds from the crater lake. She knows stories about ancestors who carved the Moai watching over her garden. She participates in ceremonies that honour them. She teaches her daughters the skills they'll need to survive and prosper in this demanding environment. She worries about her son who wants to compete in the next birdman race. She gossips with neighbours about clan politics and arranged marriages and the chief's latest decisions. She lives a full human life that archaeology reduces to potsherds and post holes, invisible except in aggregate. The chiefs, the Archimau and lesser clan leaders whose authority derived from descent and demonstrated ability to mediate with ancestors and organise collective action, carried different burdens, responsible for maintaining social order, resolving disputes, ensuring that ceremonies were conducted properly, deciding when to initiate new Moai projects, and how to allocate labour between monument building and agriculture and fishing, and all the other demands of island survival. These weren't tyrants commanding slave labour, but leaders embedded in kinship networks, whose authority depended on maintaining reciprocal relationships, on demonstrating generosity and wisdom, on successfully accessing the manor of ancestors for the benefit of their entire clan. Imagine a chief sitting in council with his advisors, arguing about whether they should attempt to carve and erect one more great Moai to honour his recently deceased father, or whether the labour should instead be directed toward building additional Manavai gardens to address the declining crop yields that have worried everyone the past few seasons. He knows that his legitimacy depends partly on honouring ancestors properly, on maintaining the traditions that connect his authority to the spiritual realm. But he also knows that people are hungry, that tensions between clans are rising, that practical needs compete with spiritual obligations in ways that have no easy resolution. Whatever he decides, someone will be unhappy, some faction will question his judgment. The consequences will unfold over years in ways impossible to predict. The children of Easter Island played among the Moai, probably climbed on the fallen ones, used the Ahu platforms as forts in games that mimicked the clan conflicts their parents worried about. Learning gradually the cultural significance of monuments they initially took for granted as permanent features of landscape. They learned to fish and farm, to identify plants and prepare food, to respect ancestors and participate in ceremonies, to understand clan relationships and social hierarchies that would structure their adult lives. Some became carvers or navigators or priests, others remained farmers or fishermen, all embedded in a small society where everyone knew everyone, where privacy was limited and reputation mattered enormously, where your identity was defined by family and clan, and the land you worked, and the ancestors you honoured. These forgotten voices, these individual humans whose experiences aggregated into the culture that archaeologists study and tourists photograph, deserve recognition not as faceless masses, but as people whose lives mattered, who loved and suffered and created beauty, and made choices that seemed reasonable at the time even when hindsight judges them harshly. They were not environmental villains destroying their paradise through stupidity and greed, nor were they noble savages living in perfect harmony with nature until outside forces destroyed their world. They were people, complex and contradictory, capable of remarkable achievement and terrible mistakes, doing their best to create meaning and survive in circumstances that were often brutal and always isolating, leaving behind monuments that testify to their humanity, even when their individual stories have been lost to time. Not everyone on Easter Island agreed about how to respond to the environmental and social challenges that intensified during the later centuries of Moai building, and the tensions between competing visions of Rapa Nui society eventually erupted into conflicts that oral traditions remember as the wars between the Hanau Ipe and the Hanau Momoko, the long ears and the short ears, though modern scholars debate whether these terms refer to actual physical differences, social classes, or clan affiliations that later retelling simplified into physical categories. The oral traditions describe a society divided between those who commanded Moai construction and those who provided the labour, between those whose ancestors stood on platforms and those who carved and moved them, between those who controlled the best land and those who worked marginal plots. This division may have been sustainable during the prosperous early period when resources seemed abundant and the future bright, but as forests thinned and soil eroded and food became scarcer, the question of who benefited from Moai construction and who paid the costs became increasingly contentious, the kind of debate that societies under stress always face about whether to maintain expensive traditions or redirect resources toward immediate survival needs. The Hanau Momoko, according to the legends, eventually revolted against the Hanau Ipe, refusing to continue providing labour for Moai projects, demanding more equitable distribution of resources and political authority, challenging the hierarchical system that had developed over centuries of increasing social complexity. The war that followed was brutal, fought with obsidian-tipped spears and clubs, contested in hand-to-hand combat across the island's volcanic landscape, resulting in casualties that small population could ill afford and creating bitterness that lasted generations beyond the actual fighting. One famous story from this conflict tells of a last stand at the Poik Ditch, where the Hanau Ipe, cornered and outnumbered, dug a defensive trench they filled with wood for burning, planning to ignite it when their enemies approached and trap them in a wall of flame. But the Hanau Momoko outflanked them, attacked from behind, drove them toward their own trap where most perished in the fire they had prepared for others. Whether this story preserves actual events or serves as moral fable about the dangers of treachery turning back on traitors, it captures the intensity of conflict and the permanent consequences of social breakdown, the way violence creates trauma that oral tradition preserves across centuries. Archaeological evidence for this warfare exists in the fortified caves scattered across the island, refuges where people stored food and water and valuables, where they could retreat during attacks and defend narrow entrances against larger forces. The obsidian matter spear points found at various sites, some still showing impact damage from hitting bone or stone, testify to weapons designed for killing humans rather than hunting animals or processing food. The toppled Moai, found face down across the island with their necks deliberately broken, suggest systematic desecration of rival clan monuments, spiritual warfare accompanying physical violence, attacks on the sources of mana that competitors claimed as their authority. But resistance took forms beyond armed conflict, including the cultural shift toward the Birdman cult that represented rejection of Moai building without rejecting spirituality itself, a reimagining of how society could be organized and how spiritual authority could be legitimized. The Birdman competition, dangerous and exciting, gave young men from any clan the chance to win prestige and bring mana to their families, regardless of whether their ancestors had ever stood on stone platforms. This was democratization of spiritual power, or at least its redistribution, creating opportunities for social mobility that the rigid ancestral hierarchy of Moai culture didn't allow. The priests and chanters who maintained Rongorongo traditions, those mysterious glyphs carved into wooden tablets, may have represented another form of resistance, preserving knowledge in ways that couldn't be toppled or destroyed as easily as stone statues, creating cultural continuity through intellectual rather than monumental traditions. The fact that Rongorongo remains undeciphered suggests that this knowledge was deliberately restricted, passed only to initiates who underwent proper training and rituals, protected from those who might misuse it, or challenge the authorities who controlled its interpretation and application. Some resistance may have been passive, families quietly choosing to have fewer children rather than bringing new mouths into a world of declining resources, individuals emigrating internally to more marginal areas rather than competing for prime land, communities reducing their participation in collective projects without openly challenging chiefly authority. This kind of resistance leaves little archaeological trace but may have been more important than open warfare in reshaping Rapa Nui society. The accumulated weight of individual choices adding up to cultural transformation even without coordinated rebellion or conscious planning. Women's resistance remains almost entirely undocumented, but was probably significant, exercised through the domestic sphere and food production and child-rearing decisions that men couldn't directly control, maintaining alternate value systems and knowledge traditions that survived even when male-dominated public culture underwent upheaval. The agricultural innovations of the later period, the stone mulching and Manavai gardens, may represent women's practical responses to resource scarcity, solutions that worked at scales and in ways that complemented rather than competed with male attention to warfare and ceremony and competition. The resistance of those who refused to accept the simplest narratives about Easter Island's history, who insisted that environmental collapse wasn't inevitable, or that the Rapa Nui weren't environmental villains, or that European contact brought the real catastrophe. This intellectual resistance has been fighting uphill against popular narratives for decades now, slowly accumulating evidence and arguments that complicate the story without making it less interesting or meaningful. This resistance happens in academic journals and archaeological reports and books that reach smaller audiences than bestsellers about collapse and ecocide, but it matters because it restores agency and complexity to the Rapa Nui, treating them as people capable of adaptation and innovation rather than as object lessons in environmental stupidity. The spirit of resistance remains alive in the modern Rapa Nui community, which maintains language and traditions despite centuries of colonial exploitation and cultural suppression, which fights for control of archaeological sites and management of tourism, which insists on being heard in debates about what their history means and who has authority to interpret it. This contemporary resistance connects to the historical resistance of those who toppled Moai and invented birdman competitions and survived against odds, a through line of refusing to accept inevitability or outsider definitions, of insisting on self-determination even in one of the most remote and economically dependent places on Earth. The darkest period in Easter Island history arrived not with environmental stress or internal conflict, but with European contact and its aftermath, beginning with Jakob Roggeveen's visit in 1722 and accelerating through the 19th century when slave raids, disease epidemics, and colonial exploitation reduced the Rapa Nui population to barely 100 people by 1877, a demographic catastrophe that brought the culture to the edge of extinction and severed many connections between survivors and their ancestral knowledge, leaving gaps that recovery would have to bridge with creativity and determination. The slave raids of 1862 were particularly devastating, when Peruvian ships seized more than 1,500 Rapa Nui, roughly half the island's population, to work in guano mines and agricultural plantations on the mainland. Most died within years from disease and brutal conditions, but the few who survived and eventually returned brought smallpox back to Easter Island, triggering epidemics that killed most of those who had remained. This created a bottleneck effect not just genetically but culturally, as most of the elders who carried traditional knowledge, who could read Rongorongo tablets, who remembered the details of ceremonies and genealogies and oral histories, died before passing their knowledge to younger generations who might have preserved it. Catholic missionaries arrived in the 1860s, bringing Christianity that mixed with, rather than replacing traditional beliefs, creating the syncretic spiritual system that most modern Rapa Nui practice, where Christ and the Virgin Mary coexist with Make and the Birdman cult, where Catholic saints blend with ancestral spirits, where Mass is conducted in Spanish and Rapa Nui with references that wouldn't make sense in European contexts. This religious transformation, often portrayed as cultural loss, can also be understood as adaptation, taking what was useful from the newcomers while maintaining connections to the past, creating continuity through change. Chilean annexation in 1888 transformed Easter Island into a sheep ranch operated for the benefit of absentee companies, confining the Rapa Nui to a small area around Hangaroa while the rest of the island was fenced for grazing, turning the Moai landscapes into pasture where sheep grazed among toppled ancestors. This colonial period lasted until 1966, nearly 80 years of exploitation and restriction, of identity denied and culture suppressed, of languages forbidden and traditions ridiculed, of economic marginalization and political powerlessness that would have destroyed lesser peoples completely. But the Rapa Nui persisted, maintained language and stories and sense of identity even when external forces tried to erase them, passed knowledge between generations even when gaps appeared, adapted and innovated while insisting on connection to the past. The cultural renaissance that began in the latter 20th century, accelerating in recent decades, represents awakening rather than invention, recovery of what nearly was lost, assertion of rights and identities that colonialism tried to deny. Language revitalization has been central to this renaissance. Efforts to teach Rapa Nui to children who might otherwise grow up speaking only Spanish, creating educational materials and media programming in the indigenous language, documenting vocabulary and grammar before the oldest speakers pass away. The language carries cultural knowledge in its structure and vocabulary, words for Moai construction techniques and navigation methods and social relationships that Spanish can't quite capture, preserving ways of thinking and being that are distinctively Rapa Nui and worth maintaining for their own sake beyond any instrumental value. Traditional arts have experienced revival, woodcarving particularly, as craftsmen create Moai kava figures and Moai pendants and other forms that connect to ancestral traditions while adapting to contemporary markets and aesthetics. These carvings appear in museums and private collections worldwide, serving both as economic resources for Rapa Nui families and as cultural ambassadors that educate others about the island's heritage. Dance and music have been maintained and elaborated. The annual Tapati Rapa Nui festival showcasing traditional sports and arts and ceremonies, creating occasions for cultural performance that reinforce identity and pass knowledge to younger generations. Archaeological research has shifted from purely extractive study toward collaborative projects, where Rapa Nui participate in decisions about what to investigate and how to interpret findings, where local knowledge is valued alongside scientific methods, where the results benefit the community rather than just advancing academic careers. The restoration of Moai and Aho has been controversial but meaningful, giving modern Rapa Nui the chance to see their ancestors standing as they once stood, creating pride and connection even while raising questions about authenticity and whether reconstruction serves cultural or tourist purposes or both. Political awakening has accompanied cultural renaissance, demands for greater autonomy from Chile, for control over land and archaeological sites, for benefits from tourism that mostly flows to outside companies and the Chilean government. These struggles continue, complicated by Chilean nationalism and economic interests and the reality that Easter Island depends on Chilean infrastructure and support even while resenting Chilean control. The Rapa Nui have achieved some recognition of rights, some measure of self-determination, but full autonomy remains contested and probably impossible given economic and geographic realities. The Renaissance extends to environmental restoration, efforts to plant native species and control invasive plants and protect seabird colonies, understanding that the health of the island ecosystem connects to cultural survival, that the Rapa Nui identity is inseparable from the land and sea that sustained their ancestors. These environmental projects often draw on traditional ecological knowledge, recovering planting techniques and resource management practices that worked before, adapting them to current conditions and constraints. What makes this renaissance remarkable is that it's happening at all, that a people reduced to barely 100 survivors have not only persisted but grown to about 8,000 today, that culture thought dead or dying has been revitalized, that Moai which once seemed merely archaeological curiosities have been reclaimed as living ancestors by descendants who refuse to see them as museum pieces or tourist attractions alone. This awakening isn't complete or unproblematic. Tensions remain between tradition and modernity, between local control and outside influence, between cultural preservation and economic development, but the trajectory is toward life rather than death, toward assertion rather than surrender, toward futures where being Rapa Nui means something vital and distinct, rather than a footnote in the history of environmental collapse. The deepest truth about Easter Island, the revelation that emerges when you look past the environmental parables and collapse narratives and focus on what actually happened and what it means, is that the Rapa Nui succeeded far more than they failed, that survival in absolute isolation for more than 1,000 years represents extraordinary achievement rather than cautionary disaster, that the Moai stand as testimony to human creativity and determination rather than monuments to hubris and environmental blindness. This truth requires rethinking what success means in human terms, moving beyond simple metrics of population growth or resource abundance to consider cultural richness, spiritual depth, artistic achievement, and the basic fact of continuity across generations in circumstances that could easily have resulted in extinction. The Rapa Nui created a functioning society on an island with no metal ores, no large mammals, no navigable rivers, no natural harbours, no nearby neighbours for trade or assistance, separated from the nearest inhabited land by over 1,000 miles of open ocean, and they made it work for more generations than the United States has existed as a nation. They took an empty island and transformed it into a human world, filling it with meaning and beauty, carving stone into ancestors, building platforms that aligned with celestial events, creating art and ceremony and social structures that gave life purpose beyond mere survival. The Moai themselves represent surplus, the kind of cultural elaboration that only appears when basic needs are met reliably enough that energy can be invested in non-essential but deeply important activities, when feeding children and maintaining shelter leave room for honouring ancestors and creating permanence and expressing values through monument building. The walking of the Moai, now demonstrated experimentally and confirmed by oral traditions that Europeans dismissed as primitive superstition, reveal sophisticated engineering thinking that worked with, rather than against, the statue's physical properties. By transporting Moai upright, rocking them forward in a walking motion using carefully coordinated rope teams, the Rapa Nui minimised wood consumption, reduced labour requirements compared to horizontal dragging, and created a transportation method that matched their spiritual understanding that these were ancestors moving through their own power, rather than dead weight being hauled. This convergence of practical efficiency and cultural meaning suggests a society where engineering and spirituality weren't separate domains, but integrated aspects of a coherent worldview. The agricultural innovations of the later period, particularly the stone mulching and Manavai gardens that emerged as forests declined, demonstrate adaptive capacity rather than environmental blindness. These techniques required observation, experimentation, willingness to try new approaches when old ones stopped working, exactly the kind of practical problem-solving that sustainable societies need. The Rapa Nui didn't passively accept degradation. They actively worked to maintain productivity, developing labour-intensive but effective methods that sustained population even as resource bases shifted. The transformation from Moai building to Birdman cult represents cultural flexibility, the ability to reimagine social organisation and spiritual practice when circumstances made old patterns impossible to maintain. Rather than clinging rigidly to traditions that no longer worked, the Rapa Nui created new ceremonies, new sources of prestige and manner, new ways of organising competition and distributing authority. This adaptability is precisely what successful societies do. They preserve core values while transforming specific practices to match changing realities, maintaining continuity through change rather than treating tradition as static and unchangeable. The survival of the Rapa Nui through the catastrophes of European contact, through slavery and disease and colonial exploitation that killed 97% of the population, through decades of cultural suppression and economic marginalization, through every attempt to erase their identity and reduce them to historical footnotes, this survival is the ultimate proof of resilience and determination. A culture reduced to 100 people, having lost most of its elders and traditional knowledge, facing overwhelming pressure to assimilate and disappear, chose instead to persist, to maintain language and identity, to recover what could be recovered and create new traditions when old ones were irretrievably lost. The revelation extends to questioning the environmental collapse narrative itself, recognizing that the story of Easter Island as ecocide has served external purposes more than historical accuracy, that it's been useful for environmental activists and collapse theorists who needed a simple morality tale about the dangers of unsustainable development. The actual history is more complex, involving climate change beyond Rapa Nui control, rat predation on palm seeds that may have done more damage than human harvesting, adaptation strategies that worked well enough to sustain population at lower but stable levels, and ultimately the recognition that the real collapse came from outside, from European contact and its consequences rather than from internal environmental mismanagement. This doesn't mean the Rapa Nui made no mistakes or faced no environmental challenges. The forests did disappear and resources did decline, and the later period was materially harder than the earlier one. But it means understanding these challenges as normal difficulties of small island life, rather than unique failure, as problems that the Rapa Nui addressed with creativity, even when they couldn't solve them completely, as context for achievement rather than explanation for collapse. The deepest truth is that the Moai walked, literally and metaphorically, that ancestors moved through the landscape with power and purpose, that the Rapa Nui created something remarkable in impossible circumstances and maintained it longer than most civilizations manage in far more favourable environments. The monuments remain, weathered but standing, testimony to human capacity for creating meaning and beauty, for honouring what matters even at material cost, for persisting through challenges that would excuse surrender. The revelation asks us to see Easter Island not as warning but as inspiration, not as failure but as success under extraordinarily difficult conditions, not as environmental cautionary tale but as testament to human resilience and creativity and the drive to make life meaningful rather than merely survivable. The Rapa Nui weren't perfect. They made choices we might question. They faced problems partly of their own making, but they were magnificently human, and they survived, and their descendants still walk the island their ancestors filled with stone guardians, still speak the language and remember the stories, still insist on being heard rather than being reduced to symbols in other people's narratives. This is the truth the Moai keep. This is what the silent stone faces know. This is what emerges when you listen to Easter Island's story with humility and attention, rather than approaching it with predetermined conclusions and external agendas. It's a story about people, complicated and capable, struggling and creating, surviving against odds that seemed impossible, leaving behind monuments that continue to inspire wonder more than a millennium after the first statue was carved from volcanic stone on the slopes of Ranararaku. When we stand before the Moai, either physically on Easter Island's volcanic slopes or imaginatively through photographs and documentaries and written accounts, we're confronting questions about ourselves as much as learning about the Rapa Nui, seeing in those stone faces a mirror that reflects our own concerns about sustainability and meaning, about what humans create and what we destroy in the process of creation, about the balance between immediate needs and long-term consequences, about the price of isolation and the value of community, about mortality and the drive to leave something permanent behind when our bodies inevitably return to dust. The Moai ask us to consider what matters enough to invest extraordinary effort, what's worth doing even when practical calculation suggests the resources could be better spent elsewhere. Modern culture tends toward utilitarian thinking, toward cost-benefit analysis and efficiency metrics, toward dismissing activities that don't produce measurable returns as wasteful or irrational. But humans have always spent resources on art and ceremony and monuments, on cathedrals and pyramids and stone faces gazing across empty Pacific waters, on things that feed the spirit rather than the body, that create meaning rather than material wealth. The Rapa Nui made a choice, perhaps unconsciously over generations rather than deliberately in a single moment, that honouring ancestors in stone mattered enough to justify the labour and resources required, and that choice built a culture that survived a millennium in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Easter Island forces reflection on the relationship between humans and environment, on carrying capacity and sustainable development, and the consequences of consuming resources faster than they regenerate. But the lesson isn't as simple as environmental activists sometimes suggest. It's not just a warning about deforestation and resource depletion, leading inevitably to collapse. It's also about adaptation and resilience, about how cultures respond when resources decline, about the creativity humans deploy when circumstances demand new approaches. The Rapa Nui developed stone mulching and manavai gardens and intensive chicken husbandry, precisely because they recognized challenges and worked to address them. They didn't passively watch their world degrade, but actively intervened to maintain productivity under increasingly difficult conditions. The isolation of Easter Island speaks to contemporary concerns about globalization and its discontents, about the benefits and costs of connection versus independence, about what happens when communities cannot rely on outside resources or assistance, when they must survive on what they can produce themselves from local materials and knowledge. In an increasingly interconnected world where supply chains span continents and most communities depend on external inputs for basic needs, Easter Island represents the opposite extreme, total self-sufficiency born of absolute isolation. The Rapa Nui couldn't import food during bad years, or call for help during crises, or learn from other societies' solutions to similar problems. They had only themselves and what they could create from the island's limited resources, and they made it work through knowledge and community and determination. This raises uncomfortable questions about modern vulnerability, about what would happen if global systems failed, if supply chains broke, if the complex interdependencies that make contemporary life possible suddenly proved fragile. Would modern societies prove as resilient as the Rapa Nui? Do we possess the knowledge and skills and social cohesion necessary to survive if we couldn't rely on external resources? The Moai stand as evidence that humans can create and sustain culture in extreme isolation, but they also remind us that such survival comes at costs, requires sacrifices and adaptations that comfortable modern life allows us to avoid or ignore. The cultural transformation from Moai building to Birdman cult offers lessons about managing change, about how societies maintain identity and cohesion when circumstances make old practices impossible to continue. The Rapa Nui didn't cling desperately to traditions that no longer worked. They created new ceremonies and new sources of meaning while preserving connections to ancestors and core values. This flexibility, this willingness to adapt form while maintaining spirit, seems increasingly relevant in an era of rapid technological and social change where traditional patterns strain against contemporary realities, where communities struggle to preserve identity while adjusting to circumstances that previous generations never imagined. The collapse narrative that has dominated popular understanding of Easter Island reveals as much about us as about the Rapa Nui, exposing our fears about environmental limits and unsustainable development, our tendency to see failure and warning rather than achievement, and inspiration, our need for simple morality tales rather than complex historical truth. We want Easter Island to teach us that environmental destruction leads to societal collapse, because that supports arguments for sustainability and conservation that many find politically useful. But imposing this interpretation requires ignoring evidence that doesn't fit, dismissing Rapa Nui resilience and adaptation, treating European contact as incidental rather than catastrophic, making the Rapa Nui into villains or fools rather than recognizing them as people facing difficult circumstances with imperfect but often effective responses. What Easter Island really means for us might be that humans are capable of far more than we often credit, that creativity and determination can sustain life and culture in circumstances that seem impossible, that the drive to create meaning and beauty and permanence is fundamental to human nature across all cultures and environments, that communities working together with shared purpose can achieve remarkable things, even with limited resources and Stone Age technology. It means that collapse isn't inevitable, even when resources decline, that adaptation is possible, that human ingenuity applied to practical problems can find solutions that work well enough to sustain population and culture across generations. It also means recognizing limits, understanding that isolated systems face constraints, that connection can alleviate, that some problems don't have perfect solutions, and sometimes the best you can do is survive and maintain dignity and pass culture to the next generation even when material conditions deteriorate. The Rapa Nui didn't find a way to regrow the palm forests or escape their island's limitations, or create abundance from scarcity. They found ways to live with decline, to maintain population at levels the degraded environment could support, to create new cultural forms when old ones became impossible. This is a different kind of success than perpetual growth and increasing prosperity, but it's success nonetheless. Survival and cultural continuity in the face of serious challenges. The Moai reflect back whatever we bring to them, and perhaps that's the deepest meaning, that Easter Island is a mirror showing us our own concerns and questions and fears and hopes, that the story we tell about the Rapa Nui reveals what we believe about human nature and environmental limits and the sustainability of civilization. The truth is probably more complex than any single narrative can capture, containing elements of achievement and failure, wisdom and mistake, adaptation and limitation, human capacity and human consequence, all mixed together in ways that resist simple conclusions or easy lessons. The Moai still stand, or stand again after restoration, their stone faces watching over an island that has changed profoundly since the last statue was carved, yet remains recognisably the same landscape where ancestors first landed in voyaging canoes more than a millennium ago. They stand on their platforms facing inland, their backs to the sea that brought both the first settlers and the later catastrophes, guardians still even if the people they guard have changed, and the threats they face have shifted from environmental challenges to cultural survival in a globalised world that doesn't easily accommodate small, isolated indigenous communities with languages and traditions unlike anywhere else. The legacy of Easter Island exists in multiple forms, in the physical monuments that draw hundreds of thousands of tourists annually, in the scientific debates that continue about Moai construction and environmental history and the meaning of Rongorongo glyphs, in the environmental narratives that use the island as cautionary example, in the Rapa Nui community that maintains identity and culture against considerable odds. These legacies sometimes conflict, the needs of tourism competing with site preservation, the stories scientists tell clashing with oral traditions that survive generations of retelling, the meanings outsiders impose often different from the meanings the Rapa Nui themselves find in their history. The stone endures, volcanic tough weathered by centuries of Pacific wind and rain, but fundamentally unchanged, capable of lasting thousands of years more if humans don't deliberately destroy it. The Moai at Rano Raraku still emerge from the quarry slopes, hundreds of them in various stages of completion, frozen in the moment of becoming, waiting for carvers who will never return to finish the work their ancestors abandoned. These unfinished statues may be the most moving, suggesting interrupted purpose, dreams deferred, the gap between intention and accomplishment that characterises so much of human endeavour across all times and places. The memory endures too, though more fragile than stone, transmitted through oral traditions that have been shaped by trauma and colonial disruption, preserved in the Rongorongo tablets that no one can fully read, maintained by the modern Rapa Nui, who insist on connection to ancestors even when specific knowledge has been lost. This memory is reconstructed partly from archaeology and linguistics and DNA analysis, scientific methods recovering information that oral tradition couldn't preserve through the bottleneck of population collapse and cultural suppression. The combination of traditional knowledge and scientific research creates a fuller picture than either alone could provide, though gaps remain and always will, some questions unanswerable, because the people who knew the answers died before anyone thought to ask. For the modern Rapa Nui, the Moai represent connection to ancestors and cultural heritage, but also economic resource as tourism centerpiece and political symbol in struggles for autonomy and land rights. This multiplicity of meaning can be uncomfortable, mixing sacred and profane, spiritual and material, but it reflects the reality of indigenous communities everywhere who must balance cultural preservation with economic survival, who live in modern world while maintaining connections to ancient traditions, who are simultaneously heirs to remarkable heritage and citizens of nation-states that often don't fully recognise indigenous rights or sovereignty. The legacy extends beyond Easter Island to influence how we think about human-environment relationships, about sustainability, and carrying capacity and the consequences of isolation. The debates about whether the Rapa Nui suffered environmental collapse or adapted successfully to changing conditions mirror larger contemporary arguments about climate change and resource depletion, and whether humans can innovate our way through environmental challenges, or whether we're heading toward catastrophe. Easter Island has become a thought experiment, a test case, a parable that different people interpret in different ways depending on what they believe about human nature and technological progress and environmental limits. Perhaps the deepest legacy is simply wonder, the sense of awe that the Moai inspire even in people who know nothing of Pacific history or Polynesian culture. The immediate recognition that these monuments represent extraordinary achievement, that the stone faces gazing across volcanic landscape embody something fundamental about human aspirations and capabilities. Tourists photograph the Moai, children draw them in school projects, the images appear in contexts far removed from their original meaning, Yet they retain power to inspire and provoke questions, to make people think about ancestors and permanence, and the drive to create something that outlasts the individual body. The Moai teach patience, if nothing else, carved slowly with stone tools by craftsmen who knew they wouldn't live to see all the monuments their work would eventually produce, built by communities thinking in generations rather than quarterly profits or election cycles, creating for descendants and ancestors more than for themselves. This long-term thinking seems almost alien in contemporary culture, obsessed with immediate gratification and short-term results. Yet it's how humans have always created lasting value, through sustained effort over time, through commitment to purposes larger than individual benefit, through willingness to plant trees whose shade will never sit under and carve statues we'll never see standing finished on their platforms. The closing is really an opening, an invitation to continue engaging with Easter Island's mysteries and meanings, to visit if possible or explore through reading and images if not, to support the Rapa Nui community in their efforts to maintain culture and control their heritage, to think carefully about what this history means for contemporary questions about sustainability and isolation and cultural survival. The Moai will stand long after we're gone, will watch over the island, through whatever changes the future brings, will continue inspiring wonder and debate, and the kinds of questions that don't have simple answers but are worth asking anyway. The wind still blows across Easter Island, salt-laden and persistent, carving the volcanic stones slowly but surely, weathering the Moai as it weathered the forest that once covered the slopes, as it will weather whatever humans build or destroy in centuries to come. The island remains, small and isolated and beautiful in its harshness, home to people who carry forward the legacy of the Moai builders while creating new traditions and facing new challenges. The story isn't finished, won't be finished as long as the Rapa Nui exist and the Moai stand and people continue to wonder about this remarkable place and the culture it sustained. This is Easter Island's legacy, written in stone and memory, in scientific papers and oral traditions, in tourist photographs and indigenous ceremonies, in environmental debates and cultural revivals, in the ongoing struggle to understand what happened here and what it means for the rest of us living on our own island, our planet Earth, facing our own questions about sustainability and meaning, and the legacy we'll leave to descendants we'll never meet, but whose lives will be shaped by the choices we make today, and the monuments, physical or otherwise, that we create or fail to create with the time and resources available to us. The Moai watch and wait, patient as only stone can be, keeping their secrets while sharing their presence, standing as they've stood for centuries, facing inland toward the volcanic peaks where they were born, guardians of memory and meaning, testimony to human achievement in the face of isolation and limitation, proof that people can create beauty and significance even in impossible circumstances, even when practical calculation suggests the effort is wasteful, even when the cost is high and the benefits uncertain, even when all you have is stone and determination and the need to honour ancestors and create something that will outlast your brief moment of breathing and thinking and feeling, and choosing to make your mark on the world before returning to the earth from which both you and the Moai ultimately came, and to which all things eventually return.